I sold our family home behind my kids' backs while they still believed we had options. Then used the remaining money to buy myself an apartment and open the bakery I'd always wanted. Before we go on, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. My name's Mariana. I'm 47. I've been a widow for a year and a mother of 3. It all blew up when I sold the only house my husband left to avoid an imminent foreclosure. Sometimes I tell it like that, directly, as if it were a cold, mathematical decision, but it wasn't that simple. Nothing was. When Julian died, the house became bigger, not physically, of course. But the silence started to fill rooms. He didn't leave any life insurance or hidden savings, just medical bills piled up in a drawer that I would open and close as if doing so could make them disappear. For months, I tried to hold it all together. I took extra shifts at work. I sold a couple of pieces of jewelry that were my mother's. I canceled any expense that wasn't strictly necessary. I even switched brands at the supermarket, as if those small cuts could stop a tide. The mortgage started to fall behind. First it was one payment, then another. The bank's letters arrived with increasingly cold words: late notice, formal notification, recovery process. The language was clean, proper, almost polite, but underneath there was a clear threat, or rather, I felt it every time I saw the envelope in the mailbox. My children didn't talk about it, or rather, they talked about something else. Daniel, the eldest at 22, repeated that this house was the only thing we had left of his father. Valeria, 19, would cry whenever someone even mentioned the word sell. Bruno, 15, would lock himself in his room and play music. They saw the doorframe where we measured their height, the tree in the yard where Julian hung a hammock, the study that still smelled of wood and coffee. I saw accumulated interest. I tried to explain to them that the situation was serious, that it wasn't an exaggeration on my part, but every conversation ended the same way. Daniel would say that something would come up, that something always came up. I wondered what that something was: a miracle, a hidden bill behind a family photo. The bank doesn't run on faith. One night, I was alone in the kitchen. It was almost 3 in the morning. The table was covered with papers, bills, bank statements. I did the math over and over. The numbers didn't add up, they just didn't. I could cut back more, yes, but not enough. I could ask for a loan, but with what collateral? The debt was already in my name. Julian had co-signed the mortgage with me, but now only my signature remained. The ultimatum arrived by certified mail: 30 days to pay what was owed, or they would begin foreclosure. 30 days. I read it standing in the entryway, without taking off my shoes. I felt something like hell opening up under my feet. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I folded the letter and put it in my purse. That night I gathered the kids, I showed them the document. Daniel read it quickly and said it was a pressure tactic that banks always threaten. Valeria started crying before she finished the first page. Bruno looked at the paper as if it were in another language. I asked them for financial help, not as a reproach, but as a reality. Daniel said he was studying and couldn't work more hours. Valeria barely covered her own expenses. Bruno was still in school. No one was wrong, but they couldn't support the house either. I went to bed with an uncomfortable certainty growing inside me. If I waited for everyone to be emotionally ready to sell, there would be nothing left to sell. And that's what started to change everything, although at that moment I was still pretending we had options. I didn't call the real estate agent the next day. I waited 2 more, as if postponing the call could give me a different sign. But the clock kept ticking, and every time I opened my email I saw the bank's automatic reminder: cold, precise, with no room for nostalgia. I contacted an agent recommended by a coworker. I spoke to her from the car in the parking lot with the windows closed, even though it was hot. She listened to me in silence and only asked how much I owed and in how much time. When I told her 30 days, she paused briefly. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to understand that this was not a normal situation. She told me she could try to move the property quickly, but that urgent offers were almost always lower. I hung up and stared at the steering wheel. I thought about Julian, about how he always said the house was our most solid investment, our foundation. It made me angry to think that that foundation was now a tombstone. The viewing started that same week. I organized everything when the kids weren't around. I opened windows, hid family photos, put away Bruno's old drawings. The agent brought young couples, investors, people who walked through the rooms with calculating eyes. Some talked about renovations, others about expanding spaces. One man commented that the yard was perfect for dividing the land. He said it with enthusiasm. I nodded, but inside I felt like I was showing something that wasn't just mine. The first offers were low. Too low. They didn't cover the full debt. The agent explained the market, the urgency, the time pressure. I did mental math while he talked. Every figure that fell short was like a door closing. At home, Daniel noticed something was up. He asked me why so many people were coming in. I told him I was evaluating options. I didn't lie completely, but I didn't tell the whole truth either. He replied that selling wasn't an option, that we could rent out a part, seek an agreement with the bank, do something. That something again. One night we argued. It wasn't an explosion. It was more of an accumulation. Daniel told me I was thinking like an accountant, not a mother, that the house was more than just numbers. I asked him if he could cover the overdue payment that month. There was silence, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. Valeria stopped coming down for dinner some days. She stayed in her room. Bruno started asking if we would have to change his school. I told him I didn't know, and I hated not knowing. Then the developer's offer appeared. Quick cash payment, clear condition. They planned to demolish and build apartments. When the agent told me demolish, I felt like someone had spoken a forbidden word. He explained that it was the only proposal that covered all the debts, including interest and outstanding medical bills. It even left a small margin. That night, I barely slept. I walked through the house in silence. I touched the walls as if they were skin. I stopped in Julian's study. Some of his books were still on the shelf. I sat in his chair. I thought about what he would have done. I had no answer, only the feeling that someone had to decide. The next day, I requested a meeting with the developer. The office was small, too brightly lit. I signed the contract with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. It wasn't a heroic moment, it was practical, direct. I transferred the money to the outstanding accounts. I paid every medical debt, every mortgage arrear, every additional charge that had accumulated like a shadow. When I made the last payment, the system showed a zero balance. I stared at the screen for several seconds. The silence afterward was strange, as if something huge had suddenly stopped. I didn't tell them anything until it was final. I didn't want to open a debate that no longer had any room. I gathered the three of them in the kitchen. The table was almost empty because I had already started packing some things. I felt the air was heavier than usual. I sold the house, I said. Daniel stood up, so quickly the chair fell backward. What do you mean you sold it? There was no alternative. That house is the only thing we have left of Dad. Valeria started to cry. Bruno looked at the floor as if searching for an explanation written on the tiles. I tried to explain the foreclosure, the debts, the risk of being financially scarred for years. Daniel shouted that he would have preferred to fight, that I gave up. Damn it, fight with what money? The argument didn't end that night. It extended into looks, closed doors, messages I didn't answer. Daniel told me I had decided alone on something that belonged to everyone. I repeated that the debt was in my name, that the final responsibility was also mine. The new owners set a date to take possession. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to dismantle years. We started packing in silence. Each box was a small farewell. Valeria wrapped plates as if they were fragile memories. Bruno packed his things without a word. Daniel barely spoke to me. The day the machines arrived, the sound was the first thing, a heavy, constant engine. I looked out the window and saw the excavator positioning itself in front of the facade. Daniel left without looking at me. Minutes later, I received a message on my phone. You sold our childhood. I felt something tighten in my chest. I didn't reply. I put on my coat and walked to the site. The tree in the yard fell first. I saw it lean, resist for a second, and then give way. The dust rose like a thick cloud. The excavator moved towards the kitchen where we had dinner together so many times. I stood there, watching the house disappear in fragments. I didn't cry. Maybe because I had already cried before, in silence, in front of a screen with red numbers. Or maybe because if I started, I wouldn't be able to stop. And as the dining room turned into rubble, I understood that the decision was irreversible. But what I didn't imagine was that the irreversible wouldn't just be the demolition. The days after the demolition were strange. There was no final dramatic scene, no solemn farewell, just dust, noise, and then nothing, an empty lot where our life used to be. I passed by there several times, almost unintentionally. I told myself it was out of curiosity to see the progress of the construction, but in reality, it was to confirm that I hadn't imagined everything. Daniel stopped talking to me beyond what was strictly necessary. Valeria responded with monosyllables. Bruno moved through my sister's house, where they were staying temporarily, as if he were a polite guest. I settled into the small apartment I bought with part of the remaining money. 2 rooms, a tiny kitchen, a narrow balcony overlooking the street. It's not ugly, it's practical. Sometimes I surprise myself by thinking I like it, and that idea makes me uncomfortable. I didn't tell them everything. I told them I had bought the apartment to ensure a stable roof over our heads, without a mortgage, without threatening letters. That was true. What I didn't say was that I had also set aside a portion of the money for something I had been keeping as a silent wish for years, to open an artisanal bakery. I always liked to bake. When Julian was alive, I made cakes on weekends. He would say I should sell them, that I had a talent. I would laugh. There was no time. There was never time between work, the house, the kids. There was always something more urgent. After the sale, with the debts paid and the balance at 0, I felt a strange emptiness, not the emptiness of the house, but another, as if I had spent a whole year reacting to crises and suddenly there was no more fire. I asked myself what I would do now, alone, wait for the kids to forgive me, become the prudent widow who manages what's left. The idea of the business started as a small, almost shameful thought. Was it selfish? Was it a betrayal? I asked myself many times, but I also told myself that I had spent years putting myself last, that if not now, then never. The amount I invested didn't jeopardize our stability. It was calculated, measured. It wasn't an impulse. I repeat that to myself. I signed the lease for a small shop, painted the walls with the help of a friend. I bought new ovens. The first day I baked there, the smell of butter and sugar filled the empty space. I closed my eyes for a second. I didn't think about the demolished house. I thought about something that was beginning. The opening was discreet. I posted some photos on social media. Nothing big, just a table with cupcakes, a chocolate cake, a sign with the business's name. I smiled in the photo. It wasn't a forced smile. That's what hurts me the most to admit. 2 days later, Daniel called me. Not to congratulate me. A cousin had seen the post and sent him the images.
His voice was dry.
He asked me where the money had come from. I explained. I tried to sound calm, rational. I told him the debts were paid, the apartment was secured, that I wasn't risking anything. You used Dad's death as an excuse to start over alone, he said. The phrase stuck with me. I didn't scream. I didn't defend myself with anger. I just felt a blow below my sternum. I tried to say it wasn't like that it had been a decision to protect us, that the business was something separate. But as I spoke, a part of me knew that for him, there was no possible separation. The demolished house and the newly painted shop were connected in his mind as cause and effect. Valeria stopped calling me for weeks. Bruno barely responds to my messages. They moved in with relatives, and although technically they could visit me whenever they wanted, they don't. The apartment is silent almost permanently. Sometimes the street noise rises to the balcony, but inside everything is too orderly, too clean. I've wondered if the mistake was selling or keeping quiet. If I had opened the real debate before signing, if I had shown every figure, every threat from the bank, every sleepless night, maybe the result would have been the same. Or maybe not, I don't know. And that doubt follows me like a shadow. I also wonder if I would have had the courage to open the business without the sale. Probably not. And that's the part one don't know how to explain without it sounding bad. I don't regret avoiding the foreclosure. I don't regret betting on myself. But I also can't deny that there was a moment in front of the contract when I felt something more than financial relief. I felt freedom. That word is dangerous when you have children who feel you took their home from them. Sometimes, when I close the shop at night, I sit for a few minutes in the back room. I look at the day's accounts. They're not huge, but they're growing. The business is starting to work, and in that small success, there's a spark of pride. Then I remember Daniel's message. You sold our childhood, and the pride mixes with something rougher. I pass by the old lot and see new foundations where our living room used to be. I imagine modern apartments, identical balconies, people who will never know what was there before. I tell myself I did the right thing, that there are no debts, no threats from the bank, no certified letters waiting in the mailbox. But when I think of my children, of how they look at me now, the certainty loosens a bit, not enough to regret it, but enough to wonder if the way I did it turned a practical decision into an unnecessary wound. And there are nights when the apartment, so safe and paid for, feels smaller than the house that no longer exists. The distance stopped being just emotional when Daniel decided to say it out loud in front of everyone. It was at my sister's birthday, a small gathering, nothing special. I brought a cake from the shop, something simple, no logo or cards. I thought maybe sharing something I had made with my own hands would soften the atmosphere. Naive. Daniel arrived late, barely greeted me. Valeria sat at the other end of the table. Bruno was glued to his phone. I tried to act normal. I served the cake. My sister said it was delicious. Someone asked how the business was going. I answered briefly, without exaggerated enthusiasm. I didn't want to provoke. Then Daniel dropped the line, as if he had rehearsed it. It's good that the business is doing well. At least something good came out of selling the house. The silence was immediate. My sister looked down. I felt the heat rise up my neck. I didn't respond instantly. I thought if I kept calm, the conversation would continue its course. But he didn't stop there. You never gave us a choice. You decided on your own. And then you show up smiling, opening a shop. He didn't raise his voice. That was worse. It was a clean accusation, without shouting, without drama, harder to dodge. I told him there was no real choice, that the foreclosure was 30 days away, that no one else was taking on the debt. He listened to me with an expression that wasn't anger, it was disappointment, as if I had failed at something deeper than a financial decision. Bruno, for the first time in months, intervened. He said he would have preferred to move to something smaller together, but not to sell, so suddenly. That word cut through me. Suddenly, for me, it wasn't sudden. It was months of bills, letters, insomnia. But for them, yes, for them it was an announcement in the kitchen, and then an excavator. Valeria started crying again, not like before, not with hysteria. She cried silently. She said she couldn't pass by the lot without feeling something break inside. I wanted to say that it happened to me too, but I held back because if I said it, it would sound like a competition of pain, and that would be even meaner. That night I left before they finished singing, "Happy Birthday." In the car, with my hands on the steering wheel, I felt for the first time that maybe the damage wasn't temporary, that it wasn't just a matter of time for them to understand. Maybe they would never understand. The following days were even colder. Daniel started looking for a place to live with a friend. He told me by message, not in person. Valeria stayed with an aunt. Bruno remained at my sister's. Technically, they're fine, they have a roof, food, support, but they're not with me. I tried to invite them to the apartment, I prepared dinner, I bought their favorite drink, they canceled at the last minute, there's always something. Exams, work, plans. I nod in front of the phone, as if they were watching me. In the shop, meanwhile, things are moving forward. A large order for a small company, a positive comment on social media, a customer who returns and brings another. Every achievement feels incomplete, as if there's a parallel account I can't balance. One day, Daniel stopped by the shop unannounced. He came in, looked around, observed the full display cases. He didn't say anything at first. I felt the absurd impulse to explain every recipe, every cost, every decision. I didn't. So this was the plan, he finally said. To start over without us. It wasn't a plan, I replied. It was a way out.
He looked at me for a long time.
He said that maybe I had saved my stability, but that a family doesn't work like a company that you liquidate to start another. And that's when I understood something I had resisted seeing. For him, the house wasn't an asset. It was the last space where the four of us were still US before death split us into two different times. I try to say that we are still a family, that a place doesn't define that, but the phrase sounded hollow even to my own ears. When he left, he didn't slam the door, he just went out and closed it gently. That minimal gesture weighed on me more than any shout. The confrontation had no clear end. There was no reconciliation or formal breakup, just increasingly visible evidence of the damage. There are no debts, no threats from the bank, but there are empty chairs at my table. There are conversations that no longer happen, and I'm beginning to understand that some decisions, even if necessary, are not measured only in numbers. They're measured in who stays and who leaves. Over time, you learn to live with the silence. It doesn't disappear, but it changes shape. It's no longer the heavy silence of the bank letters or the empty house before the demolition. It's another, more stable, more permanent. The business continues to grow. It's not a chain of bakeries or anything like that, but it works. I pay suppliers on time, the numbers are in order. Sometimes, when I close the cash register at the end of the day, I remember those early mornings in front of the medical bills, and I think that at least that nightmare is over. There are no certified letters, no automatic calls, no threats. The stability I fought so hard for is real, but stability doesn't fill a table. Daniel moved in with a friend near the university. I found out through third parties. Valeria started working more hours and hardly ever comes by my sister's house. Bruno remains the quietest. When he answers my messages, they're brief. I'm fine. Yes. No, thanks. I try not to pressure them. I tell myself they need time, that grief isn't processed in a straight line, that I'm learning too. I pass by the old lot, and now there's a structure up, solid foundations, straight columns, identical windows aligned, as if they had always been there. No one walking down that sidewalk would imagine the tree that fell first, or the kitchen that was crushed under an excavator. Sometimes I stare a few seconds too long, not to punish myself, just to remember that decisions leave a mark, even when the landscape changes. I've often thought about that question that doesn't quite leave me alone. Did I save our future, or just secure my own? The answer isn't clean, it's not black or white. I avoided the foreclosure. I eliminated debts that would have haunted my children for years. I also made a decision alone, quick, final. I didn't give them a space to participate in something they felt was theirs. I don't regret avoiding the foreclosure. I don't regret betting on myself. But I also can't deny that the silence with which I signed made the blow deeper. I defended the family's stability, and yet I acted without consulting them. That contradiction accompanies me. There are days when Daniel looks at me as if I had destroyed something more than bricks. And maybe, in his way of seeing it, he's right. The demolished house wasn't just a property, it was a symbol. I chose economic reality. He chose memory. In between, a rift was left that money can't repair. I keep baking, I keep paying bills on time, I keep sending messages that sometimes go unanswered. And although the business started as a spark of freedom, now it's also a constant reminder of what it costs to ignite it. They think I betrayed a memory. I think I saved our future, and in between, something was left that I don't know how to rebuild. Story 2. I promised to leave my daughter my entire inheritance if she obeyed me, but then she moved in with her boyfriend without asking me. So I cut her out of the will and thought it was the lesson she deserved. Before we go on, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. I slid the will into the drawer while her chat was left on read. If everything was going to be hers someday, why did she refuse to ask me for permission? I only asked to participate, and I ended up changing everything. That's the part no one wants to hear completely. It sounds simple when I tell it fast, but it isn't. None of this was. My name's Marcella. I'm 58 years old, and I'm Camila's mother. Camila, 27. The conflict started when she decided to move in with her partner without consulting me, even though I always promised her she'd inherit my house, my business, and my savings. I always repeated it like a background song for years. All this will be yours. The house where she grew up, the small family business I built alone after my divorce, the savings I kept putting away while other people went on trips, and I stayed crunching numbers in the kitchen. I didn't have more kids. She was my project, my legacy. I didn't see it as pressure. I saw it as a natural continuity. If someday she was going to run the business, it made sense for her to learn how I thought. If she was going to inherit the house, she had to value stability. It wasn't control, it was coherence, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I always asked her to consult me on important decisions: who she dated, what jobs she accepted, where she invested her money. Not to forbid, but to guide. That's what I thought. I'd lived through a complicated divorce. I'd built everything from scratch. It was only logical that I'd want to spare her from mistakes. If everything was going to be hers someday, I had the right to know how she moved.
For years it worked like that.
She called me before signing contracts. She asked my opinion on job offers. She even told me details about her dates. I listened, gave my opinion, sometimes suggested things, and felt something I wouldn't know how to describe without sounding dramatic. I felt like we were still a team. But the Friday night she told me she was moving in with Dario, something broke. She announced it like someone reporting a schedule change. We already signed the lease without a wedding, without finishing her master's, without a prior conversation with me.
We already signed.
That phrase echoed in my head like a slamming door. It wasn't him, it wasn't Dario, it was the improvisation, it was that she didn't need me. I asked her to wait a year, to finish her studies, not to mix love with assets. I told her stability isn't built on impulses. She listened to me in silence, and then dropped something that still burns when I remember it. "I don't need your permission, Mom." That phrase marked the beginning of our silent war.
We didn't yell.
There were no broken plates. It was worse. It was a crack that began to expand without making a sound. I wasn't asking for obedience. I was asking for participation, or so I wanted to believe. But that night I ended up alone in the living room, looking at the walls that would someday be hers, wondering at what point she went from consulting me on everything to deciding her life, as if I were just another spectator. I didn't sleep well that week. I kept telling myself it was a phase, that she'd ask for my advice again when she saw how complicated it is to share expenses, decisions, responsibilities. That she'd understand I'm not her enemy. I'm the person who held all this together for her. But something changed in the way she answered messages. She took longer. She replied shortly. Sometimes she left me on read for hours. That little blue notification started to weigh more than any open argument. And that's when, without realizing it, I started thinking about the will, not as a promise, but as a tool, a guarantee. If everything was going to be hers, she had to behave like someone who understands the value of what she'll receive. I didn't say it out loud, not yet, but the idea began to settle in silently, firmly, because if freedom was so important to her, I could also exercise mine. And that was just the beginning. I didn't react right away. That's what surprises me the most, when I remember it. I didn't make a scene. I didn't call anyone to vent. I smiled at family gatherings. I tended to the business as always. I made coffee in the same mug every day, but inside something had tensed up, like a string pulled too tight that you know will break at any moment. Camila moved in with Dario the following month. She let me know the exact date, almost like a logistical fact. I went to see her the day before. I walked around her room with that weird feeling of entering a museum. The walls were the same, the books in the same order. The window with the curtain I'd picked out when she was 15. I thought about all the times I told her, "All this will be yours." And for the first time, that phrase didn't sound sweet. It sounded like an at-risk investment. She didn't invite me on moving day. I found out through a photo she posted. Boxes, laughs, Dario carrying a lamp. I looked closely, searching for something to justify my discomfort, a gesture of insecurity, a doubt in her eyes. I didn't find anything. She looked calm, and that irritated me more than I should admit. That's when I decided to get more involved. If she was going to take the step of living with a partner, at least she should do it with order. I suggested reviewing her accounts together to help her get organized. I told her the first year of living together is usually unstable, that it's better to be safe than sorry. Asked for access to help her organize herself. I framed it like that, as support, as guidance. She didn't reply right away. When she finally did, it was with a short message. "There's no need, Mom. We're fine."
We're fine.
That plural started to bother me. It wasn't her and me anymore, it was her and him. I was left out. I started calling her more often. If she took a while to answer, I insisted. It wasn't harassment, it was worry. At least that's what I repeated in my head while dialing her number for the third time. I also asked her for photos when they traveled. Nothing exaggerated, just to know where they were. If I saw a weird movement in her expenses, I asked her. Not in an accusing tone, just curiosity. But every question seemed to build an invisible wall between us. One Sunday, I suggested that Dario sign a prenup just in case. I said it calmly, like someone talking about the weather. They weren't married, I know, but things change fast. I just wanted to make sure that if something went wrong, the assets wouldn't get tangled up. That's when she exploded. You're trying to buy my life. I froze.
Buy.
That word hit like a slap. I didn't want to buy anything, I wanted to protect. Wasn't it logical that as long as her name was in my will, I had the right to give my opinion? I told her just like that, without yelling, with a firm voice. As long as you're in my will, I have the right to worry about what you do. The conversation ended abruptly. She didn't hang up on me. She simply stopped talking. Silence. And then distance. She started canceling lunches, replying with monosyllables. At family gatherings, she sat far away. My sister Lucia noticed the tension and clumsily changed the subject. Dario didn't greet me with the same warmth anymore. Everything was polite, but cold, like a spotless house, with no one inside. I told myself I was setting boundaries, that I couldn't allow a lifetime of effort to be exposed to impulsive decisions, that if she wanted independence, she had to accept that independence also has consequences. But the truth is that every time I saw the drawer where I kept the will, I felt a strange mix of power and threat. Power because I knew I still had something that defined the future. Threat because I was starting to understand that maybe it was the only thing I had left to influence her. One night she called me to say they were considering investing in a small project together. Nothing huge, something modest, but she mentioned she might need an initial loan. She said it cautiously, as if anticipating my reaction. I listened in silence, and while she talked about plans and numbers, something settled inside me. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. If freedom was her flag, then it had to be complete, without an invisible safety net. That same week, I made an appointment with the notary. I didn't do it crying, I didn't do it trembling, I did it like someone reviewing just another contract. And while I signed the papers that changed everything, I thought maybe I was teaching her the most important lesson of her life. I didn't know I was actually writing something very different, and that the first consequences weren't going to be financial. They were going to be silences much longer than I was prepared to endure. The day I left the notary, I didn't feel guilt. I felt something colder, order, like when you clean a drawer full of old papers and finally know what stays and what gets thrown away. I removed her name as the main beneficiary and designated a local foundation that supports women entrepreneurs. I did it with a calmness that still surprises me. It wasn't an impulse, it was a cold decision. I didn't tell her right away. I waited. That wait was almost an experiment. I wanted to see if at some point she'd come looking for me like before, if she noticed the distance, if she asked anything more than what was strictly necessary. But the weeks passed, and our relationship was reduced to practical messages.
How are you?
Good. The business is still stable. I'm glad. Sometimes I'd open the drawer and look at the perfectly folded document. I kept telling myself that I defended what's mine, that no one has the right to live without considering the effort behind every wall, every paid bill, every accumulated saving. And yet, when I said it out loud in the empty kitchen, it sounded different, harsher. I started asking myself things I wouldn't allow myself before. At what point did my promise turn into an invisible contract? I always told her, all this will be yours. I never gave her explicit conditions, I didn't draft rules, but they were floating there. Consult me, include me, think like me, choose with my logic. Maybe they were never spoken agreements, maybe they were my expectations, arranged like heavy furniture in the middle of the way. One afternoon, I found myself rereading old conversations, her asking my opinion on a job, me correcting details, her telling me she was going out with someone, me investigating a bit too much. At the time, they seemed like normal gestures. Now, seen from afar, they had another texture, as if every bit of help came with a fine string tied to the end. I didn't do it out of malice, really, I didn't. It makes me angry to even think someone could believe I planned to manipulate her. I built that business alone after the divorce. I stayed up whole nights checking numbers while she slept. I gave up things I wanted so she wouldn't lack anything. How could I not expect to at least be consulted? But Camila's phrase kept coming back over and over. So it was never support, it was a contract. She said it weeks later, when I finally blurted out the truth. She called me to tell me they were considering investing in a small project with Dario. She mentioned she might need a loan. She didn't ask directly, she hinted at it. And I took advantage of that opening. You don't need to consult me anymore. You're no longer the heir. There was a long silence. Not one of those awkward ones, a heavy, dense one. What does that mean? She asked at the end. And I explained in a calm voice that the assets now had another destination, that freedom has consequences, that no one can ignore the rules and expect rewards. While I spoke, I listened to myself. I sounded convincing, reasonable, almost pedagogical, but beneath every sentence there was something I didn't name: pride, fear, the feeling of losing ground. Her response wasn't yelling, it wasn't crying, it was worse. So it was never support, it was a contract, and she hung up. After that, the silence became more solid. There were no dramatic scenes. She didn't come to complain. She didn't try to negotiate. She simply accepted the new reality and excluded me from hers. That reaction threw me off more than any fight. I'd imagined something else. A long conversation, a reconsideration, maybe an apology, not this sharp calm, as if by taking away her inheritance, I'd also taken away the last weight that forced her to stay close. Sometimes I think I accidentally did her a favor. I confirmed something she suspected, that my support had conditions, that my love was crossed with expectations. But then I defend myself. I tell myself I'm not the only mother who expects participation, that it isn't irrational to want to protect what you built with so much effort, that if someone is going to inherit your entire life in the form of assets, they should at least consider you in their important decisions. The doubt appears in small moments when I see a photo of her and notice she smiles without tension. When my sister Lucia avoids mentioning her name at the table to not make me uncomfortable, when Dario walks past me and barely nods, they didn't ask me for anything. They didn't demand I reverse the decision, and that absence of pressure forces me to look inward more than I'd like. If protecting was my intention, why does everything I defended feel empty now? That question settles in my head at night. I don't share it with anyone, not even with myself out loud, because admitting it would be accepting that maybe I confused stability with control, that I turned a promise into a tool of pressure. The will is still in the drawer, intact, legal, correct. And yet, every time I touch it, I don't know if I'm holding my security or the clearest proof that I lost something no document can bring back. After that call, there were no explosions, there were no soap opera scenes, there was something more uncomfortable: fake normalcy. Days passed without messages, then weeks. When we finally ran into each other at a family gathering at my sister Lucia's house, everything seemed carefully choreographed to avoid the subject. Camila arrived with Dario, greeted everyone, me too. A quick kiss on the cheek, as if I were a distant aunt. I felt the gesture as an official demotion of my place in her life. She asked me about the business with flawless politeness. I replied with the same formality. Neither mentioned the inheritance, but it was there floating between the plates and glasses, like an invisible guest. Dario barely looked at me. He wasn't rude, he was distant, and that distance, so contained, pierced me more than any open reproach. At one point I heard them talking with my sister about the small project they wanted to launch. They sounded enthusiastic, confident. There was no trace of regret, there were no hints about loans, nothing. That's when I understood something I didn't expect. My decision hadn't caused the earthquake I imagined. There was no begging, there were no negotiations, just a silent reconfiguration of their plans. The business was still running, the house was still spotless. I still woke up early, opening blinds, checking accounts, but the routine started feeling heavier. Not because money was missing, something else was missing: a projection. Before, every improvement to the house had a clear meaning. This will be for when Camila inherits it. Now the phrase lost its recipient. I tried to keep control of the little I had left. If she wasn't coming to visit me, I wasn't going to insist either. If she didn't call, I wasn't going to beg. I convinced myself that silence could also be a form of dignity, but silence doesn't feel dignified when it lasts too long. One afternoon, I texted her to ask how her project was coming along. She replied hours later. "We're doing well, we're tweaking details." She didn't add anything else. She didn't ask my opinion. She didn't share numbers with me. That were sounded again like a door closing softly. I caught myself wondering if I should reverse the will, not because I wanted to give her control back, but because I was starting to notice that the punishment wasn't working as I expected. If the intention was for her to understand the weight of her decisions, reality was showing something else. She seemed lighter without that promise, but undoing it meant admitting I was wrong, and that word weighs more than any legal document. There was a specific moment when I felt the real blow. I had a birthday. We always celebrated it at the house. She helped organize, brought flowers, stayed late cleaning up. That year she arrived with a simple gift and left early. She said they had to wake up early. I didn't argue. I didn't complain. I just watched her close the door with a naturalness that hurt me more than a slam. The inheritance no longer ties her to me. That phrase appeared in my head as a cold realization. And I no longer know if that was justice or pride, because by taking away her inheritance, I also eliminated the last practical reason to stay close. What was left was just the bond, and that bond, without conditions, seemed more fragile than I imagined. I started to notice the external damage clearly. At family gatherings, the mood was briefer. Lucia looked at me with a mix of reproach and pity she tried to hide. Dario doesn't even greet me anymore when we cross paths. Barely a minimal gesture. Camila maintains a distant courtesy, as if I were someone she respects, but doesn't need.
I had wanted to protect my assets.
I succeeded. No one can say I didn't defend what I built, but by doing so, I moved a piece I can't put back in its place. Sometimes I open the drawer and look at the document. It's perfectly folded, spotless. It represents legal control, authority, decision. And yet, every time I put it away again, the house feels bigger, emptier. I thought I was teaching a lesson. Maybe the only lesson was for me, that influence isn't maintained by clauses, that bought obedience isn't closeness, and that when you turn support into a condition you're left with everything, except the person you started building it for. The business is still stable, the house is still tidy, the will is still in the drawer, and my daughter is still living her life, without asking my permission. There was no dramatic reconciliation. There was no final scene where someone cries and everything is fixed. What there was wear and tear, slow, constant, like a leak that makes no noise at first, but ends up staining the ceiling. As the months passed, I started noticing I wasn't waiting for her messages with the same anxiety anymore, not because it hurt less, but because I was getting used to it. That's the most unsettling part. You get used to almost anything, even to your daughter no longer consulting you on anything important. The small project they had with Dario started showing signs of stability. I found out through third parties. Lucia mentioned it one afternoon carefully, as if she feared I'd explode. I didn't explode. I nodded. I said I was glad. And it was true. Somewhere deep down I was glad, but I also felt something sharp, an uncomfortable certainty. They didn't need me. The business I built is still running well. The numbers are in order. Sometimes I catch myself wondering who will run it when I no longer can. Before, that question had an automatic answer. Not anymore. Now it's a blank space. I've thought many times about going back to the notary, about undoing the change, about putting her name back where it was for years. But every time I get close to that idea, another question appears that stops me. Would I do it out of love or out of fear of ending up alone? If I revoke the decision now, would it be a sincere gesture or a new strategy? Why do I have to admit something I didn't want to see before? By changing the will, I didn't just protect my assets, I regained a sense of control. A feeling I had lost the day she said, "I don't need your permission, Mom." It was my way of responding, cold, legal, flawless. And yet, the price wasn't symbolic, it was real. My relationship with Camila is minimal. We talk just enough. We see each other on specific occasions. She doesn't come to the house she thought she'd inherit. She doesn't ask about the business she would someday run. Her life moves parallel to mine, like two lines that were once joined and now move forward apart. The inheritance no longer ties her to me, and I no longer know if that was justice or pride. Sometimes I sit in the living room at night and look around. Every wall, every piece of furniture, every detail has a story I always imagined sharing. I thought the legacy was a form of continuity, almost a guarantee against being forgotten. Now I understand that no document forces anyone to stay. If protecting was my intention, why does everything I defended feel empty now? That question has no easy answer. I defended what is mine. No one can deny that. But I also turned a promise into a tool of pressure. And when I removed that tool, I discovered there was nothing left that forced my daughter to choose me. Camila lost a promised inheritance. I lost the illusion that assets could ensure closeness. There was no yelling, there was no reconciliation, just a distance that became a habit. And now I wonder if I ever understood the difference between support and control. If my daughter's freedom was really a threat, or if what scared me was no longer being the center of her decisions. The will is still in the drawer. I'm still here. She's still there, and the silence weighs more than any fortune. Popular comments. Anonymous comment 1. I feel like you always saw the inheritance as a thread to keep her close. Sometimes we think we're protecting when in reality, we're holding back. Don't you think that could have suffocated her? OP's reply. I didn't see it as a thread, I saw it as continuity, but I understand that from the outside it might feel like a tightening rope. Anonymous comment 2. Your daughter made an adult decision, and you responded with another adult decision. The problem is that both decisions created distance. Maybe no one really wanted to lose. OP's reply. That's the hardest thing to accept. I didn't want to lose her, but I acted as if winning was more important. Anonymous comment 3. Asking for access to her accounts changes the story a lot. That doesn't sound like advice anymore. It sounds like an invasion.
OP's reply.
I thought I was helping her get organized. Now I understand that help without limits can feel like control. Anonymous comment 4. I get the impression that it hurt you more that she didn't need you than the move itself. That hurts, but it's part of them growing up. OP's reply. Yes, I think that was the real wound, feeling displaced from her center. Anonymous comment 5. What's most striking is that she didn't beg. That changes the whole dynamic. OP's reply. I thought she would. I was wrong, and that reaction forced me to look at myself more than I expected. Anonymous comment 6. An inheritance should be a gift, not a condition. When it becomes a bargaining chip, something breaks. OP's reply. I never wanted it to be a bargaining chip, but I admit I used it as a tool. Anonymous comment 7. Maybe she's calmer now because she no longer feels that invisible pressure.
That also says something. OP's reply.
I've thought about it. Maybe by taking away the promise, I also took away the weight. Anonymous comment 8. Sometimes pride disguises itself as principles, and it's very hard to tell them apart. OP's reply. That line is thinner than I imagined, and I crossed it without realizing it. Anonymous comment 9. You can still choose to reach out without talking about money. Maybe that's where the difference is.
OP's reply.
It's hard for me to separate the two, but I know that if I want something different, I'd have to start there. Anonymous comment 10. Keeping everything and ending up alone doesn't sound like a victory. Maybe the question isn't who is right, but what's worth more.
OP's reply.
That's the question that stays with me now, and I still don't know how to answer it.